Welcome to Conspiracy Q, folks. Buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously wild stuff. We're talking about Operation Harvest Control.
Yeah, this is a top secret investigation based on some, well, let's call them recently uncovered or classified sources.
Right. These documents are supposedly from something called the Independent Agriculture Truth Council.
Level black clearance, they say. And we're going to try and break it all down for you.
We're talking about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. But not just the usual stuff, oh no, this goes way deeper.
The central claim here, and this is huge, is that GMOs were never really about, feeding the world.
Oh no, according to these documents, it's all about control. Global biotechnological hegemony, they call it. Chilling stuff.
So first things first, these sources lay out a bunch of, let's say, strange connections and patterns that they think point to a deliberate effort to manipulate the system.
Right off the bat, they talk about this revolving door between Monsanto, the big GMO giant, and government agencies like the FDA, EPA, the USDA, you name it.
Think about it. The agencies meant to regulate the industry are suddenly filled with people who used to work for the companies they're supposed to be overseeing.
The big example they give is Michael Taylor. This guy goes from being a VP at Monsanto straight to the FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Food. Talk about a conflict of interest.
Or, as the source puts it, a conflict of humanity. And while he's there, a whole bunch of GM crop approvals get fast-tracked, just boom, boom, boom.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Like, what's really going on here?
Right. It really erodes trust in the system, like who's looking out for us, who are these agencies really serving?
And then they get into this whole thing about independent research on GMOs being suppressed, just like disappearing.
Yeah, they talk about this 2009 study by Dr. Gilles Eric Seralini that found a link between GMO corn and tumors in rats.
Pretty alarming stuff, right?
Yeah.
But what happened next is even crazier.
So the study ends up getting retracted, which is already a big deal in the scientific world, but it gets worse.
Way worse. These sources claim that Seralini's lab was vandalized.
And some of his co-authors were getting death threats. Talk about a hostile environment for anyone questioning the safety of GMOs.
Right, like someone really doesn't want this information getting out there.
And they mention other scientists too, like Dr. Arpad Pusztai and Dr. Ignacio Chapela, who were basically ostracized from the scientific community after they published research critical of GMOs.
Almost like a coordinated effort to silence dissents, right? Like control the narrative.
Exactly. Then you've got the whole controversy around the Terminator gene. This is technology that would make seeds produce only one generation of crops.
Meaning farmers would have to buy new seeds every year. Monsanto denied ever working on it, but...
But these recently uncovered or classified sources point to leaked patterns from the USDA and a company called Delta and Pineland that seem to confirm research was being done.
It just raises so many questions about who's really benefiting from all this innovation. Are they trying to help farmers or trap them in a system where they're totally dependent on these big companies?
Right. Where's the line between progress and control?
Okay, so the next part of these documents gets into some really disturbing allegations about the impact of GMOs on our health. It's a section they call Population Control and Health Degradation.
Yeah, heavy stuff. And one of the first connections they make is between the rise of GMOs and the huge increase in food allergies, especially in kids.
They point out that after the widespread introduction of GMOs, which was around 1996, food allergies in children in the U.S. tripled. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean GMOs are the cause, but it's definitely suspicious timing.
Right, like correlation doesn't equal causation, but it's definitely worth investigating further.
And then there's glyphosate. This is the herbicide that's used with a lot of GMO crops, Roundup. And these sources claim it's wreaking havoc on our guts.
They argue that glyphosate messes with our gut bacteria, which can then lead to a whole cascade of health problems. We're talking autism spectrum disorders, autoimmune diseases, depression, you name it.
And they claim that a lot of smaller studies showing these links have been suppressed or ignored. Like the big official studies say there's no problem, but these smaller ones are being buried.
Again, it raises questions about who's funding the research and what agenda they might have.
Okay, so this next part is where things get really, almost dystopian. It's called GMOs and pharmaceutical symbiosis.
Basically, the idea is that as our food becomes less healthy because of GMOs and all these chemicals, people are getting sicker. And then who profits? The pharmaceutical companies.
And the really creaky part is that a lot of the same investment firms, like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, They own big shares in both the agrochemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry.
So you've got the same people profiting from both sides of the equation, making us sick and then selling us the cures.
It's a pretty cynical system, if you ask me.
It really makes you question the motivations behind these industries. Are they truly interested in our health, or is it all about the bottom line?
Then we get into some truly mind-blowing and frankly terrifying technology. They talk about DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and their Insect Allies project.
Yeah, this was a project that was looking at using genetically modified insects to spread viruses to crops, supposedly to protect them from pests and stuff.
But these sources are raising alarm bells about the potential for this technology to be weaponized. Like, imagine genetically modifying viruses to target specific crops or even specific populations through their food.
That's some serious sci-fi stuff right there, but it's not as far-fetched as it sounds.
And then they bring up this other connection that's just, I don't know, eerie. They talk about the similarities between the synthetic RNA found in GMO crops and the mRNA vaccines.
Right, like, could there be some unintended consequences from messing with our genes in this way? Could it be having some unforeseen impact on our own DNA?
It's definitely something to think about. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the geopolitical implications of all this. And the picture these sources paint is pretty bleak.
They talk about the devastating impact of GMOs on farmers in India, specifically the tragic rise in farmer suicides.
They claim over 290,000 farmers have taken their own lives since 1995, and they link it directly to the high cost of GMO seeds and the pesticides they require.
These farmers are basically trapped in a cycle of debt because they have to keep buying new seeds every year. And then, tragically, many of them end up drinking the pesticides they're using on their crops as a way out.
It's heartbreaking, and it really shows the human cost of this kind of corporate-driven agriculture.
Right. It's not just about yields and profits. It's about people's lives and livelihoods.
And then they get into these international trade agreements like TTIP and USMCA and how they've been used to force countries to accept GMO imports.
Like, if you don't play ball, you get hit with sanctions, and they cite leaked EU memos that show lobbyists basically writing food safety standards to benefit these big biotech companies.
So much for fair trade, right? And to top it all off, they talk about how these companies are funding pro-GMO studies through these fake nonprofits.
Yeah, like the Genetic Literacy Project. It sounds all official and independent, but it's actually funded by Bayer, which owns Monsanto.
So it's basically propaganda disguised as science. Okay, now we're getting into some real conspiracy theory territory. The next section is called Documented Cover-Ups and Disappearing Data.
This is where they start talking about deliberate efforts to hide information and silence anyone who's raising concerns about GMOs.
They mention redacted files obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests between the USDA and Monsanto. And these files have phrases like, "don't disclose this," and "industry sensitive."
Sounds like they're hiding something, doesn't it?
And then they bring up this thing called Project Helix, and the claim that a bunch of scientists who are working on GMO risk assessment projects have died or disappeared under mysterious circumstances.
Like, between 2000 and 2010, at least 5 scientists connected to these projects vanished or were found dead.
They give some specific examples, like Dr. Vandana Ramesh, who died in a car crash where there were no skid marks and the brakes supposedly failed.
And Dr. Isaac Fong, a champion swimmer who somehow drowned.
It's all very suspicious.
And then there's the claim that reports on the negative impact of GMOs on soil health have been suppressed. Apparently, GMO monoculture is causing massive damage to the biodiversity of our topsoil. And there's a quote from an internal memo that says, "Public concern would derail funding if microbial collapse is published."
So they're basically admitting that they're hiding the truth because they're afraid of losing funding. Unbelievable. Okay, so now we get to the final section, the grand finale, if you will, and it's called The Ultimate Plan.
This is where they lay out their theory about the real agenda behind GMOs.
And it's all about control. They talk about the Codex Alimentarius conspiracy.
Which is the claim that the UN's food standards are being manipulated to favor GMOs and all these synthetic additives while making it harder for people to access natural remedies and organic food.
The idea is to create a world where only the food that's approved by these corporations and governments is legal. And then they talk about the future of genetic engineering with things like CRISPR and synthetic biology.
We're talking about the ability to literally reprogram life. And they quote Craig Venter, who was an advisor to DARPA, saying, "We are this close to reprogramming life."
And their point is that if they can control our genes, they can control us. It all leads to this very stark conclusion. GMOs were not the future of food. They were the future of control.
And then they hit us with that chilling Henry Kissinger quote, When you control oil, you control nations. When you control food, you control people.
It's heavy stuff. So, to sum it all up, these sources are claiming that GMOs are part of a much bigger plan to control the global food supply, our health, and maybe even our very DNA.
And they see this as being driven by corporate greed and a lust for power. Now, it's important to remember that these are just allegations. We're not saying this is all definitely true.
But the evidence they present is certainly compelling, and it raises a lot of important questions that we all need to be asking.
Like, who's really in control of our food system? And what can we do to ensure that we have access to safe, healthy, and affordable food that's not being manipulated for someone else's profit?
Great questions. And on that note, folks, I want to leave you with one final thought. Given all these connections between corporations, governments, and our food, what kind of changes do we need to make to reclaim our health and our future?
That's something for you to think about.
It is. Rate and follow Conspiracy Q to share the truth.